There we go. Well, hi from Nebraska. If you missed it earlier, I put a photo of flowers behind me because it seemed more cheery than the photo of a snowstorm I had behind me, which was what we looked like last week. We've got about a foot of snow on the ground and more coming. We've had a couple days of fog and hoarfrost, and it's winter. Um, so it's kind of nice to talk about prairies with people in a place where there's some green apparently on the ground. I want to talk tonight about a project that I started back in 2018 that has grown into something much bigger than I thought it was going to be. The original idea for the project just sort of came to me because I write a blog and post. I try to post twice a week, sometimes more, sometimes less. But I feel a lot like a preacher sometimes, where I'm trying to find new ways to tell old stories, or share information about the same topics, but in ways that keep people interested. So I came up with the project I'm going to work on, or I'm going to talk about tonight, while I was just sort of doing that, trying to come up with different ways of talking about prairies and the importance of diversity. So I want to start out with this question. You're all fans of prairie, so just think for a second and visualize what comes to your mind when you think about prairie. I think for most of us, it's probably, or potentially, something like expansive landscapes. This is the Nebraska sandhills, which we're really lucky to have close by here. Or it might be bird species that are tied to grasslands. It might be bison or other sort of larger animals that you might see in a prairie. Or it might be plant communities, really diverse and flowery plant communities. But now, stop and think about, what do you think your friends who are not prairie people envision, or what do other people um, around the country, around the world envision when you say the word prairie? And I'm guessing that most people think of flat fields of grass, or just sort of a landscape that doesn't have a lot that's very interesting. And this is a problem. It's a big problem, because you and I can look at this picture, and even though it's not full of wildflowers, you can see plants in there that you identify with. Even if you don't know the species, you can see that they're different from each other, and there's a lot there that you could stare at and think about and come up with something interesting to think about with it. But the problem we have is that if most people in the world, or in the country, or in the state find prairies to be not that interesting, it's going to be really hard for us to convince them to support the work that we're trying to do to conserve and restore and manage prairies well. And so one option that people use is to, try to introduce people to the facts, right? Let's talk about why prairies are important, why nature is important. If you want clean water and carbon storage, and there's all these really big reasons that prairies are important, and all of them are true, but I don't think it's necessarily the best way to start a conversation with somebody. I think it's more valuable, more effective to talk about stories. And so it's a lot more interesting probably to start out by talking about something like a bobolink, which is a grassland bird. It looks like a little blackbird with a lobotomy. It sings like R2-D2 as it flies around the prairie. There's all kinds of fun things you can talk about with bobolinks. That's a much easier way to get someone to see prairies in a different way than maybe they would when they start. Or you can talk about something like burrowing owls, right? Which are these amazing little charismatic owls who live in holes in the ground, which is interesting by itself. And then they decorate the outside of their burrows with little bits of cow dung or bison dung or whatever dung they can find, because that attracts dung beetles, which is one of their favorite foods. There's all kinds of fun things you can talk about with burrowing owls. And again, that's a more engaging way maybe to get somebody to think about prairies. Or you can talk about this gorgeous little blue-eyed bee, which is called the blue sage bee. It's a bee that specializes on this plant, this blue sage or pitcher sage. It's a salvia. And as far as we know, this is the only plant that the blue sage bee can get pollen and nectar from. And so it's a very tight relationship between the two. It's only out for 3 or 4 weeks a year, because that's when that flower is blooming. It's a fun little story. Or you could talk about my absolute favorite insect of the world, which is the camouflaged looper, which I've been fortunate to see, I think, 4 times in my life, even though it's fairly widespread and common. But the reason I don't see it very often is that it is really good at camouflage. So it eats flowers, and as it eats the flowers, it'll take little bits of flower and stick it to its back as a disguise or as camouflage. And then as they dry up, it'll replace it with fresh ones. And then when it switches flowers, it'll change its costume to match the new flower that it's feeding on. Just a really cool little insect. It's an inchworm. It turns into a moth called the wavy-lined emerald, if you're interested, little green moth. Not nearly as pretty as the caterpillar full of flowers, but still cool. Anyway, so all of that is a precursor to this project I want to talk to you about tonight, because the project really is another way to tell stories about prairies in the hopes of getting people interested in either interested in the first place, or maybe more interested, or to see prairies in a different way than they did before they heard about the project. So the project started right here in Lincoln Creek Prairie, which is in the town that I'm in right now. It's my hometown of Aurora, Nebraska. This is about, I don't know, 3/4 of a mile away from my house, just on the other edge of town. And it's a tiny little strip of prairie. If you can look at the far left side here, that little white building that you can just barely see behind the trees, that's the local dog pound. They don't call it that, but that's what it is. Excuse me. And there's a little trail that runs through, but this prairie is very skinny. At least the patch that I was in, you could walk across it in about 30 steps, probably, between trees and then a big mowed area that's next to the city dump. So it's not anything special compared to, any other prairie that you might be able to find. And in January 2018, almost this time of year, I walked out there and I put 4 flags in the ground to mark the corners of a square meter. And I spent the next year, well, here's another photo of the plot. Well, I wanted to say I didn't choose this scientifically. I didn't do a random selection. I tried to find a square meter plot that was going to be representative of the site, but I also wanted to make sure that it had at least a couple of plants that would be fun to watch over the year. And I'll talk about those here in a minute. And so what I did then was I said, I'm going to spend the next year, I'm going to spend as much time as I can find here in this little square meter plot. I'm going to try to photograph as much as I possibly can within this little site. And so from here on out now, every photo you see till the end of my talk will be something that was taken within this one little square meter of prairie. Yeah, that's what I just said. So I did this for a year. Over that year, I made 46 different visits to that little plot. The average length is just something I did kind of, it's funny to do averages, but it was, there were days where I would go and I would spend 10 or 15 minutes maybe. And then there were days that I'd be there for an hour and a half. And then there were days I went back twice. And I'll talk about one of those here in a little bit too. And while I don't want to start conversations talking about numbers and statistics, it was interesting that over the year 2018, I found 113 different species in that plot. And when I say I found them, it means that I photographed them and I got a photo that I thought was worthy of publication. So a good quality photo of 113 species. I saw other things that I never got photographs of because they just didn't sit still. There was a little juvenile rabbit that hung out right next to the plot all the time. There was a vole that had a tunnel through the plot, and I knew the tunnel was there, and I saw the vole's rear end once, but I never got a photo of it, so I didn't count it. And there were some birds and things that I'm sure were coming and going that I never caught. But of those 113 species, there were 15 different plant species. There were 22 species of flies, which is pretty impressive, I thought. 18 different kinds of beetles. There were 14 different kinds of bees. And then there were 44 other animals in the plot over that year. But what I really want to do is I want to talk about stories. So I'm going to tell you some of the stories of the species I found, the experiences I had, and then we can talk at the end about other stories and anything else you want to talk about. So one of the species that I knew was in the plot, and one of the reasons that I chose this plot, was butterfly milkweed. And butterfly milkweed, I was excited about because the plant is pretty, but also it's really attractive to pollinators. So I thought that would be something that would be good to attract a lot of things to take photos of. I like to take photos of insects. And so I was really looking forward to it. Unfortunately, my plans didn't work out the way I thought. And this right here is the only insect that I photographed on butterfly milkweed flowers the entire extent of the year that I was out there. I never saw another insect on these flowers. I have no idea why, because as I walked into the plot, I'd walk down that trail and I'd look at other butterfly milkweed plants that were blooming, and they were loaded with butterflies and bees and moths and wasps and all kinds of fun things. And then I'd get close to my plot and I'd stop from a distance and I'd look in, and there was nothing there. And as a result, instead of getting a whole raft of milkweed pods, which I was really looking forward to because milkweed seeds are a lot of fun to photograph, I got one pod, which at least tells me that I wasn't missing a lot of pollinators that were there and I just didn't see them. It just, that flower, for whatever reason, didn't get very well pollinated. And so as a result, that one pod became something that I got a little bit obsessive about, because I was watching it like a parent would watch their kid, and I didn't want to miss the seeds when they came out. So I showed up one morning about 10:30 in the morning, kind of a bright overcast day, a really nice day for photos. And I was excited because I saw that the pod had split open. And I thought, okay, this is great. Over the next couple of days, I'm going to see lots of seeds. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'm going to make sure I'm here tomorrow morning when the light's good. I took a few pictures of other things and I went home. And I was doing some other things around the house that afternoon. And about 2:30 in the afternoon, I realized that I couldn't stop thinking about that milkweed pod. And my thought was, what happens if it opens today and all the seeds are gone by the morning? So grabbed my camera, drove back across town. And sure enough, when I got there, it was open and the seeds were still there. So I spent some time photographing it that afternoon. Got some nice photos of the seeds as they were, starting to come out and be attractive. And then I did come back the next morning. The seeds were still there the next morning. They were still there the day after that. So I didn't need to have panicked like I did, but it was still fun to see them early. And I spent several days coming back to that plot and just photographing milkweed seeds and other things, but milkweed seeds in different, from different angles. And as soon as they started to fly off, I would get photos of them as they got caught on plants. And I photographed a lot of butterfly milkweed seeds over that period of time. So that was my butterfly milkweed story, which didn't turn out like I would hoped, but it still makes a good story, I guess. And then one of the other species I was excited about was lead plant, which is it's a prairie shrub, but also a wildflower in that it has very pretty flowers like this. And it's also pretty attractive to lots of insects. And I did see some insects on it, even as it was starting to bloom. This little orange beetle showed up. There were a lot of different kinds of pollinators that came to it, including this wasp. And this bee, which I found out later, is actually a specialist on lead plants. So it, like the blue sage bee, to some extent, is really, attracted to lead plant. I think it's not quite as specialized. I think it will feed on other things, but this is a little digger bee that feeds nearly solely on lead plant. So it was exciting to see it show up in this little tiny prairie, surrounded by crop fields and town, that had found a host plant for itself. And then there were just all kinds of other things that showed up, like this really interesting beetle. And this beetle, which is, I don't know if you have these in Texas, I hope not, but you probably do. This is the Japanese beetle, which is a real pest in gardens and starting to be so in farms. And it and its friends ate most of the flowers off of the lead plant before it produced seed. And then one of the things that was kind of neat was that I didn't realize, I'd never paid attention to lead plant in the autumn. And I didn't realize that it got fall color, which I guess makes sense. It's a shrub, and a lot of shrubs have leaves that change colors in the fall, but I'd never paid attention to it before. So it was kind of neat to photograph that too. But I would say the species that I was most excited about was stiff sunflower. And stiff sunflower is a perennial sunflower, Helianthus passiflorus, if you're a Latin person. And I was excited about it because A, it's a really pretty plant. B, it's also really attractive to pollinators, but also lots of other insects that like to feed on the pollen and nectar from it. And what happened here was interesting too, because if you notice, there's 3 little beetles in this photo, and they become really important very soon. And here's a better photo of it. It's a kind of leaf beetle. I haven't gotten a complete identification on it yet. Nobody seems to know what the species is, but it's a leaf beetle of some kind. And it really likes stiff sunflower apparently, because as soon as one of those flowers would open up, it would just get swarmed by these beetles, which would eat every part of the flower that they could, um, just sort of demolishing anything that would be attractive to any other kind of insect. So yet again, I was foiled by a plant that I thought was going to be really exciting to photograph. And this was fun to photograph. It was a neat story to photograph, but it was not what I was expecting. And this is what all those sunflowers look like by the time the beetles got done with them. And there just wasn't much left. Here's another photo of it. You can sort of see through the petals, which is not something that's supposed to happen. And then there were a couple that didn't even get that far because they got hit by a weevil, which is it's called the Silphium weevil or the head cutting weevil. There's other names for it. It's a really cool little insect. So it's a kind of beetle that basically decapitates sunflowers, and then they lay their eggs in the flower itself. And then eventually the flower falls all the way to the ground, and the larvae, which are inside the flower by this point, then crawl right down into the soil. And so it's giving them a very easy and direct pathway down to the soil where they're going to overwinter and then come out the next year. So it's a really cool story, really neat little bug, but not very helpful to a photographer trying to get photos of insects on a sunflower. So fortunately, what saved the day was Maximilian sunflower, which I was also excited about, but not nearly as much as stiff sunflower. It's a great plant, though, Maximilian is. It can be, here at least, it can be overabundant in some sites, especially kind of CRP fields or restored prairies where they use a little more seed than they maybe should have. I don't think it's necessarily aggressive, and especially where we're grazing, which we do a lot of grazing, it's pretty easy to keep it from being overly abundant for too long. But it's a species that some people would see as kind of weedy almost. But holy cats, it's a great plant for pollinators. So, here's 3 of them, 2 bees and a soldier beetle all at the same time. And that was pretty common. There were a lot of pollinators drawn to Maximilian sunflower. And some of them were really tiny. You see the little wasp in this photo right there. And then others were, much bigger, like bumblebees. And so Maximilian sunflower sort of highlighted my late summer in the plot. And one of the things that showed up was soldier beetles, which you saw in the earlier photo. And they're a really interesting little beetle that are kind of charismatic too, because they're not afraid to just stare at you with their pollen-filled faces. So I have a lot of pictures of soldier beetles with their faces full of pollen, like that and that and that. And so I had a lot of fun photographing them. And then at some point, I got sort of ready to move on, I guess you would say, from soldier beetles. And the soldier beetles were not ready to move on. So I would try to take a picture of a sunflower flower and there'd be a soldier beetle on it. Or I'd try to take a picture of a bee and there'd be a soldier beetle right there also. Or another bee with a soldier beetle on it. And eventually I started to kind of think maybe they were photobombing me on purpose. So they'd be in the background of a lot of photos. And sometimes I wouldn't notice them until I got home and started looking at the photo up close. And sure enough, there'd be a soldier beetle in the background. So this is a really neat picture of this hoverfly, except that there's a soldier beetle in the foreground. Or here's another picture of a little native bee with a soldier beetle in the background. And it got to be kind of a running gag. And then one day they were gone. So they were in the plot for about 8 days, and then they sort of disappeared. And about that time is when I finally got a photo of the first monarch butterfly that showed up in the plot. It's something I've been waiting for all summer. I figured it'd show up at some point, and it didn't until migration season. And this photo I took right before it flew off. This was in the morning, but it was warm enough that the butterfly was pretty active. And so I got one quick shot and then it left. And I thought, okay, well, it's at least good enough to count it on my species list. That's great. But then a couple days later, I came back again in the morning and there was another monarch there that was a little cooler and not quite ready to fly. So it sat really nice for a couple of portraits. And I felt better about, using that as on my species list. And then I want to talk about flies a little bit because I mentioned earlier, I think there were 22 different species of flies, and that might be surprising to you that was the most abundant group of insects, but it shouldn't be because actually in North America, it's the most abundant group of insects we have. So you think about beetles being very species rich, and beetles are, and globally, they're the most species rich group of insects that I'm aware of. Most of that's driven by the tropics. The tropics have just beetles on beetles on beetles. And we've got a lot of beetles in North America, but I think they're third behind flies, number one. And then I think bees, wasps, and ants. That group of insects, I think, is second. But it's estimated that there are 61,000 species of bees or flies in North America. So just let that sink in for a second. 61,000 species of flies. How many can you name? Housefly, horsefly, deerfly, maybe a couple others. There's 61,000 estimated species. Now, estimated because we don't even know how many species there are for sure, because there are a lot of them that haven't been identified yet. So that's an estimate. It's probably a conservative estimate. And it's just crazy to think about. So this fly right here might be a housefly. It looks like a housefly, but I'm not an expert on flies enough that I'm going to tell you that this is a housefly for sure, because there are a lot of flies that look like houseflies that aren't, like this one or that one. And then there are some that look different, right? This is definitely not a housefly. This is definitely not a housefly. This is a picture wing fly that looks like it's wearing a gas mask. And this little fly, I did learn something about it. This is the first time I'd seen it, was in the plot, which was kind of fun. And as I was reading about it, it turns out that it eats rotten vegetation, both as a larvae and an adult. And then the males, to attract females, will regurgitate some of that rotting vegetation, and they'll have a little kind of a droplet of that rotting vegetation hanging down from its mouth. And apparently that's really attractive to females. So guys, take note. And then there are tiny little flies that were clearly not house flies. This is Indian grass. And if you're familiar with Indian grass and where the leaf comes off the stem, the little appendages there, that gives you a sense of scale. That is a tiny, tiny, tiny little fly. This is another fun one. This is a long-legged fly, which is iridescent green, has really long legs, which is why it's named that. And it's smaller than a housefly. And apparently it's a predator, which I didn't know until this project. It eats little ants. It'll catch all kinds of little tiny insects and eat them. Doesn't look to me like a predator, like a robber fly or some of those other things do. And then there's lots of flies that are pollinators and feed on nectar and or pollen, including this one, which looks very similar to this one, although they're different species. And they will feed not on just on wildflower pollen, but a lot of them will really hit grasses hard. So here's Indian grass in bloom. You could see the anthers in yellow and the stamens or stamens? Now I forgot. In white there, the little feathery thing, the female part. Stigma, right? Yeah. Anyway, and then this is another one that looks a lot like a bee. It's a fly, and the way you can tell it's a fly, by the way, I mean, the technical way to tell is you're supposed to count the wings, right? So a fly has 2 wings, a bee has 4 wings. It's really hard to do that when there's a bee that's alive and crawling around on a fly or on a flower. It's hard to really count the wings because they're all held together. They look like there's just 2 of them, even on bees. My trick is a little bit easier, which is I look at the antenna. If you see the antenna here, it looks like they're on what it looks like its nose, but they're stubby little antenna. Bees generally have fairly long antenna, something that looks like antenna. And then they also have a lot smaller eyes. So flies have eyes that look like they take up the majority of their face, where bees have really big eyes, but not quite that big. And then I found all kinds of other insects. A lot of which I had never noticed before I did this project. And it's not that I'm an expert in insects, but I do spend a lot of time in prairies with a macro lens looking for insects to photograph. And so the number of things that I had seen or that I had never seen before at all, let alone identified, was really sort of amazing to me. I didn't expect to find that many new things. And this was an insect that I'd never seen before. And when I first saw it, you tell me what you think. But what do you think that is when you look at it? My thought was it was an exoskeleton of some kind of an insect. My first thought was it looked like a fly exoskeleton, which makes no sense because flies don't molt, they don't shed their skin. It doesn't make any sense. But that's what came through my mind first. But it was clearly an exoskeleton because it's hollow, right? I mean, you can see right through it. It's translucent. So it was on a dewy morning. I thought, oh, this is great. There's a little exoskeleton sitting on this leaf, and I was going to have an easy time photographing it because what's it going to do? And so I got my camera set up on my tripod, and I got really close, and I got focused in, took a couple of shots, and then it started to walk. And that kind of freaked me out a little bit because I didn't think it was alive. And then I realized it was alive and not a zombie insect at all. And then a couple of weeks later, I got another photograph of it, either the same individual or another individual of the same species. I'm not sure. And I got this photo allowed me to identify it. It's a plant hopper. So a plant hopper is not at all a fly. And it's got these huge wings for this body size with iridescent little blue spots on it. Just an amazing little creature that, sticks a little proboscis into plants and sucks the juices out. Never heard of it. Here's another plant hopper that I'd never seen before. And I guess it's not super surprising that I hadn't seen it based on the camouflage, but now that I know what to look for, I see them all over the place in this same prairie and other prairies nearby. It's called a two-striped plant hopper. It's another plant hopper that, feeds on the juices of plants. So here it is on lead plant. Amazing camouflage though. Doesn't it look like just a little tiny leaf? And then this was one of several specialist insects that I found within the plot. So I mentioned that wasp earlier, which was fun, or not the wasp, the bee that was on lead plant. But here's longhorn milkweed beetle, which feeds on milkweed plants. It can handle that toxic latex that's inside milkweed plants. So it was there for the butterfly milkweed. And here's a little milkweed bug that was there for the same reason. And then here's a bee that is a specialist on sunflowers. There were several of those. There were sort of sunflower specialists that were on Maximilian. They're not specialists to Maximilian, just sunflowers in general. And then here's that bee again that was on lead plant. And then there were some fun spiders, including a lot of them that looked very similar. And I had to make sure that I talked to somebody who knows spiders to tell me they were different, because this spider looks a lot like that spider. And that spider looks a lot like this spider, but those are 3 different species. This one I knew ahead of time. This was a lynx spider, like the cat, lynx. And I had seen it because when we do sweep nets with kids sometimes at work, we would catch a lot of these little lynx spiders, but I'd never gotten a photograph of them because they don't sit still. They run around. They don't spin webs. They're hunters. They're just kind of free moving hunters. And they didn't really want me to get close. But with this project, what I found was that I was sitting very still with my camera, just sort of peering into this small space to see what I could find. And if I could find it before it recognized that I was moving around, I could sometimes get a photo of an insect, or in this case, a spider. So I got some photos of lynx spiders for the first time, which was really exciting. And then one day I was there watching one of those lynx spiders, and I noticed this cute little fly nearby and got a photo of it real quick. And this is a tiny little fly with a white abdomen. And then within a couple of minutes, I got to watch the lynx spider and the fly interact, which worked out well for the spider and not so well for the little fly. And you can see the silk there. So the spider does use silk, but not to spin a web. So it just ran up and caught that little fly, snuck up behind it, and grabbed it. But it was fun to see those kinds of interactions happen. And again, the reason I was seeing them was that I was spending time looking at prairie in a very different way than I normally do. Normally when I'm photographing, I walk around with my camera and I'm sort of scanning the prairie, looking for good light, looking for something colorful or interesting shapes or textures. And here I had to force myself to just sit still and watch for anything that I saw and really look. And sometimes it would take me, 5 or 10 minutes to see a little creature that I had been staring at for that whole time and just hadn't recognized because I hadn't looked in the right place at the right time. Here's another spider that, again, my rule was that I had to get a good photo if I was going to count it on my list, right? So I got home from this photo and got this photo. This is the only photo I got of this little jumping spider that day. And it was this gorgeous little metallic jumping spider. I was really excited to see it. And then it jumped right as I was taking the picture, which is what, invertebrates normally do when you try to take their pictures. And so my internal argument with myself was, okay, is this an artistic photo of a jumping spider that shows its behavior, or is this just a really bad photo of a spider? And I was still arguing about that a couple of weeks later when I got to see the same spider again, and it sat nicely and I got some photos of it. Again, don't know if it was the same individual or a different individual of the same species, but whichever it was, I also got to watch it do some hunting, and I got to watch it catch its prey also, which was really neat. But isn't that a gorgeous little spider with kind of a gilt edge on it and everything? And here's the other jumping spider species I saw, which has these amazing blue fangs on the front of it. And if you look really closely, you can see me in its eyes, reflected in its eyes there. I think the most charismatic invertebrate that I photographed was the Chinese praying mantis and the European praying mantis, which I also got photos of. But I also have mixed feelings about this because these are an invasive species. They're not native to the US. They were brought in as biocontrol insects, which is a bad idea because while they do eat pests, they also eat anything else they can catch, including a lot of really good insects like monarch butterflies and sphinx moths and lots of other things. Um, but regardless, they're here, and the population at Lincoln Creek Prairie, where I was at, is pretty high. So I see them quite a bit over there, and I do enjoy photographing because, oh boy, they are charismatic, aren't they? I mean, the fact that they can turn their head 180 degrees sure doesn't hurt. The fact that they have those little black pupils on their compound eyes, which are not really pupils, they're called pseudo pupils because they're just a trick of the light. So as you move, the angle of the light reflecting through the eyes makes it look like the pupil follows you, which is really cool or creepy, depending on your point of view, but it's not happening. It's just a trick of the light. But it doesn't make them any less cute and fun to photograph. And then here's the Chinese mantis, which looks very similar. The eye is slightly different. And if you can't see it in this photo, but they're under their armpits, they have a black spot with a white center that identifies them as a European mantis instead of a Chinese. But my favorite day, the best day of the whole year, was Tree Frog Day, because I live in a part of Nebraska where we're just starting to get Cope's gray tree frogs moving far enough west to be here, which is neat because of the frogs, but probably bad sign for prairies because the reason they're showing up is we're getting more and more trees that are moving west across the state that allow tree frogs to establish. But regardless, tree frogs are amazing. I had seen one once before in eastern Nebraska and then just had never been in the right place to see one since. And I had some friends in Aurora here who would call me or tell me, hey, I had a tree frog on my screen door this morning. It was really neat. One person even called me and said, hey, you should come get a picture of this tree frog. And by the time I got there, it was gone. So I'd never been in the right place at the right time. And so it was pretty crazy to me that I saw my first one ever in Aurora in my little square meter plot. And it was really very kind and considerate to me. It posed really well for photos. It would just sit in different poses and I could nudge it a little bit after I got bored with it sitting one way, and it would sort of readjust itself and then look at me and let me take its picture again. And then it would jump to another place and I could take its picture again. It was amazing. Just a gorgeous little creature. So those are some of the stories that I wanted to share. And then what I want to do now is I'm just going to run through a series of photos that were taken during the rest of the year. And there's not a whole lot of them, but the point of this is just to show you how much I was able to find within a tiny little place in a tiny little prairie in a tiny little town. And a lot of times it wasn't the species that I was really interested in. It was water droplets or patterns or textures or colors that were just as interesting to me as finding a new species or a different kind of insect or plant or something like that. And it really forced me to look at prairies, like I said, and photograph prairies in a way that I should have been doing anyway, but I wasn't. And it's even now I see prairies a little bit differently than I did because I spent so much time kind of focusing in on a small area and trying to find everything I could. Look at the antenna on those beetles. Those are some really longhorn beetles. So I'm just going to flip through these. This is, we're in the summer months here. One of the things that was shocking was the number of grasshoppers. I saw one grasshopper and I saw one katydid. And if you don't know the difference between grasshoppers and katydids, they're real similar. But grasshoppers have short antennae, like this one does, and katydids have really long antennae that are about as long as their body or longer. That's the easy way to tell them apart. Here's an aphid, purple prairie clover, which only had two little blossoms on it. I didn't even know it was there until it bloomed. It was really small. All kinds of these little beetles, which are really fun to watch and then, try to get somebody else to help me identify. Several little small green bees like this one, little metallic sweat bees. Not as many butterflies as I was expecting. Saw one damselfly the whole time. This is a cute little wasp that showed up. Here's another little green metallic sweat bee, different species than the first one. More ants. There were several ant species that showed up. Another sunflower. Here's Indian grass in flower. Another beetle. Here's big blue stem in flower, which doesn't get enough attention for its flowers. It's a gorgeous little flower too. And then as fall came in, colors started to change. The sunflowers that had been really generous in terms of attracting pollinators started to wilt, and the grasses started to dry up. There were still a few insects around, or they were getting harder to find and less common. There's a stink bug that was still around in October. And then the grasses started to keep drying up. Flower stems dried up. The insects got really rare. This is the second to last insect I think I photographed next to this one, which I don't know why this hoverfly was still sticking around when we got a late October snowfall, but it was alive. It moved around a little bit after I took its photo. And then the season kind of came to an end. And once winter hit and got well underway, I went back a few more times every time it snowed or we got a nice frost, but there wasn't as much activity to take pictures of. It was still fun to go back, but it just didn't change nearly as much. And I want to end with this photo because I think this photo to me is emblematic of the whole project. It is, A, I like the photo, but B, I like the photo a lot because it reminds me of the day that I took it and the experience that I had when I was taking it. This was a photo that I took in May, which was right when I was trying to decide if this project was actually going to have legs or not, because I went a couple of times between January and March, or January and May. I went out maybe 2 or 3 times to the plot because, again, nothing was happening. It was all dormant and brown. And so if there was a frost or a snow or something, I'd go out and take photos. But otherwise, I just wasn't finding a whole lot to photograph. And I wish now that I'd spent more time, because knowing what I know now, I think I would have found more to photograph, but I didn't know at the time. So this is a photo in May before anything was flowering in the plot, and I was trying to find something to photograph. And what I noticed was I really liked the way the light was coming through the sunflower leaves and really showing off the veins. So I got on the opposite side of the leaf from the sun, so the sun would shine through really nicely. And as I was doing that and watching and scanning the leaves, I noticed all these ants that were moving up and down the stem. And they would crawl out onto a leaf and then back onto the stem and go again. And they probably were looking for extra floral nectar. So a lot of plants, including sunflowers, will produce this sweet substance in a place not their flowers. And they do that attract, well, I don't know if they do that to attract ants, but it definitely does attract ants because ants have a sweet tooth. And then those ants can help probably prevent herbivores from being as damaging to those plants. So it's probably a good strategy. But anyway, so I watched those ants go up and down. I thought, if I sit here long enough in one place and I just focus on a leaf, and if I'm patient, one of those ants is probably going to walk right into the frame and I can get a photo of it. So I thought, well, I've got nothing better to do. I'll do that. And I sat there for about 10 minutes, and I don't think I'm exaggerating that. It felt like longer, but I think it was about 10 minutes before the ant finally came into view and stopped long enough for me to get a photo of it. And what was neat is it's not only is the leaf kind of translucent, but the ant itself is a little translucent with light coming through it. So that worked out as kind of an extra bonus. But I like this photo because it was sort of the first time I think I realized the potential for the project if I sat still and tried to look at prairies in a different way than I had before. So to sum up, the first thing I learned is not something I learned, but it was the point of the project in the first place, which is to show people how much happens in a prairie, even within a little tiny area. And I was hoping to get people excited about prairies in a way that they would be willing to come visit and try to find what they could find, and to visit numerous times, because every time you come, there's something different happening. And I really wanted to emphasize the fact that, this was not a prairie that was unique or particularly special, although obviously it's special. It's a neat little prairie, but there are lots of other prairies that you can find the same kinds of diversity, the same kinds of species that I found in Lincoln Creek Prairie. And I really want that. I want this project to change the way people see prairies, think about them as something other than, a flat area of grass. And the thing that was surprising was how inspiring the project was to me, right? I said earlier, I did this because I was looking for stories to tell others, and it ended up, really impacting me in a way that I wasn't expecting. And I still today see prairies in a different way, and I explore prairies in a different way than I did before I did this project, and, spent hours just staring at a tiny little area to see what was going to happen next. So that's my talk. The project, as I said earlier, has really taken off. It's turned into a book now. And this is a book I wrote for the Nature Conservancy, so I don't make many money off of it, but I'm trying to get people to read it. So I would love it if you would buy the book and share it with people. I don't make a dime off of it, but It's also, we're building a museum exhibit. The Nebraska State Museum is going to host a 6-month exhibit on the project, that's a lot of fun. We're trying to design exhibits now around this project. We're even thinking about a documentary. The public television station is interested in running a documentary on it. I mean, stuff I never imagined when I put those 4 yellow flags in the ground on a January afternoon. So anyway, that's what I've got. And it looks like there's lots of chats, so we can stop and answer questions or whatever else you want to do. So would you like me to go through the chat, which I can, and just start answering questions from the top down? Does that make sense?
Sure.
Yeah, do that.
Okay, I'll do that. So first question I see is, are blue sage bees in Texas? And I don't know that. Do you have pitcher sage, Salvia azurea? If you do, you probably have the bee.
Yes, we do. Actually.
Okay, then yeah, it's probably around. So keep an eye out for kind of a white and black striped bee with a really gorgeous set of blue eyes, and that'll probably be it. Let's see, other questions.
Chris, one question I had, but I didn't include it in the chat, was what is CRP? You mentioned that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you for asking that. CRP, Conservation Reserve Program. It's a USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture cost share program that encourages people to take cropland out of production and put it into permanent cover of some kind. It used to be that permanent cover would be, 1 or 2 species of grass. Nowadays, a lot of people are using it to do better restoration work. Yeah, thank you for asking that. That's jargon that I shouldn't have used. What entity owns and manages Lincoln Creek Prairie? That is, it's a really neat organization called Prairie Plains Resource Institute. It's an organization that probably has 200 or 300 members. It's a local Nebraska, kind of Eastern Nebraska organization, PPRI for short, or Prairie Plains for short. You can go to prairieplains.org and look at their website. It's a great little site. And one of their big focuses is these little local prairie preserves in and around towns, and they try to work really hard to get people involved in getting out to those prairies. So we have a real similar mission. And then the last question that I see on here is just what kind of camera that I use. And I use a Nikon camera. It's a Nikon D7100 is the actual model. I bought it used. I buy all my stuff used if I can. It's probably a $700 or $800 camera. So it's nothing like a high-end kind of camera. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles that you can get, but it does what I need it to. And then most of these photos you saw today were taken with a macro lens, which is it's 105 millimeter Nikon macro lens. And so it allows me to magnify insects, but it also gives me a little bit of working distance. I don't have to get right up in their faces because it's a longer lens. And although, yeah, it's still, I mean, it's, like I said earlier, most of the insects get away before you get a photo. That's just what insect photography is like. Address for my blog. Yeah, I had it on that last slide and then I got rid of the slide. Here, I'll share it one more time. We might as well look at that for a second.
I just posted it in the chat also.
Oh, great. That'll work too. So yeah, prairieecologist.com. There you go. I guess I'll have to stop sharing so I can see the chat. Suzanne. Hey, Suzanne, by the way, I see, it's nice to see you here. You comment on my blog all the time, which I appreciate.
Hey, Chris.
The Nebraska State Museum is in Lincoln, so not exactly in Omaha, but not far away either, about an hour away. And it's on the university campus in Lincoln. Specifically, it's called Morrill Hall, and it's also known as Elephant Hall because they've got a bunch of mammoths and all kinds of sort of I was going to say historic elephants. That's not the right word, but mammoths and other old animals like that. So I think that's all the questions in the chat. So if there's anybody else have questions, you want to just unmute and we can talk about whatever.
So I do have 2 questions. One, was this all natural lighting? Did you use any type of flash?
Yes, it all is natural lighting. I own a couple small flashes that I don't think I've used for about 6 years. I bought them because I thought maybe it would be helpful. And what I found is I liked using them in woodlands a little bit when it was dark and shady. But I don't go to woodlands very often, so I just don't use them much. And I really like the way natural light looks. And so I haven't used flash. I probably should, because there's some times where I could probably get better photos, but I don't enjoy doing that as much.
Yeah, it's a
Did
little
you have
more.
to use focus stacking when you were doing your macro?
Nope. I don't even know how to do that, honestly. I know friends that use it, and I'm sure I could learn. But focus stacking, one of the issues with focus stacking is you have to get a lot of pictures of the same thing without it moving. And that just, boy, in the wild, that's really tough to do with something, because they just, even if the insect's not moving, the plant it's sitting on is probably waving gently in the breeze. And I haven't worked out a system that would make that very feasible.
That's true. Thank you.
Yeah. I do see a couple other questions.
Have other people started trying this out? Have you noticed?
That's been really fun, because I've heard from several people, not several, more than several people, who have done something like this either in their backyard or just were inspired to look at prairies differently. The Madison Arboretum up in Wisconsin started a project where they encouraged people to come, like they marked out some square meter plots and then encouraged people to come across during different times of the year and take their own pictures in the square meter plots that they had there. I've heard about some schools that have been trying this, or parents using it with their kids this last year during COVID. It's really been fun to see people responding in that way. Okay, so somebody's asking, oh, what year did I take the photos? It was 2018. And then did I use Seek or iNaturalist or any other apps to identify the organisms? I didn't use those two, although they're both good. I used Bug Guide a lot, which is, I think, the best identification way or best identification tool for insects. Especially if you have a photo, you can submit it on the Bug Guide website, and an expert will look at it and identify it for you and then send you an email with the identification. And then they'll add your photo to their library of photos. And that's the other way you can use the site, is you can go to bugguide.net org, bugguide.net, I think it's bugguide.net. And I can put it in the chat, but it's, there we go. You can hit browse and you can just start scanning through a bunch of photos of different kinds of invertebrates. And you just keep picking ones that look more and more like what you saw until you get close enough that you can usually, if not identify the species, you can get pretty close. And it's just a really handy tool for those of us who are not entomologists. And then the other way I identified a lot of things is I have very generous friends who I could send photos to, and they would take the time to scan through them and key them out, or tell me, at least tell me that there was something different. Because a lot of my insects, I don't have identifications for. I don't know what the species is. I just know that I have, this one is different than this one, and those two are different than this one, so I can count them as three different things, because that's sort of what insect is like. There are very few. I have friends that know insects well, and they say they're not entomologists, because to be an entomologist, you have to know all about insects, and you have to sort of specialize, because there's just too many. Don is asking about aperture settings. But yeah, depth of field with macro photography is really tricky. So it's depth of field in general with close-up photography is very shallow, which means that the area front to back from you to the subject that's in focus is not very wide. And so you can, what I always do is if I can see the eye of the insect, or any animal, this applies to large animals too. If you can see the eye, you want to make sure that you focus on the eye, because if the eye is sharp, then the photo is going to look good to people, because when we look at each other, we look at each other's eyes. And the same thing happens when you look at animals. You whether you think about it or not, you look at their eyes. And so if you have a photo in which the eye is out of focus, it's sort of unnerving or unsettling. So I always try to make sure the eye is in focus. And then in terms of aperture settings, something in the 14 to 20 range, f14 to f20, if you know anything about aperture settings, that's the range I work in most of the time. So I think that's all in chat at the moment. So any other questions from live discussion?
Yeah, Chris, if you did this again, what would you do different?
I mean, I would use a different site just because it would be fun to, try again in a different place. But the other thing I have thought about is doing it in the same space and just seeing how many things I find that are different than the year I spent, which I think would be a lot. Um, I just I haven't been motivated to do it yet. I've thought about it multiple times and just haven't gotten there yet. I think the other thing I would do, I would definitely, like I said before, I would definitely spend more time in the early spring and the dormant season, um, just looking for things, because I think I would find patterns and textures and interesting things to photograph that I wasn't really thinking about the first time. So those would be,
Chris,
yeah.
was the year a typical year in weather? Was it dry or was it a wet year? Because that would also make a big difference.
Yeah, that's great. That's a really good point. I mean, it was, I would say it was fairly average. It wasn't overly wet or dry. Um, oh, but that reminds me, one thing that was different is normally that prairie gets burned in the spring because it's along a trail. They like to burn it. And then the Prairie Plains, the organization that runs it, uses a combine. It's right on the edge of town. They bring their little combine and they'll run around and harvest seed a lot of times. So they try to burn so they can get the seed off of it. And I was expecting it to be burned. So when I set up the plot, I thought this is going to be great. I'm going to have to go find my flags again after the fire, which will be kind of hard, but I knew roughly where it was. And I thought it would be really fun to get, photos of the little green leaves coming up in the black ash and all those sorts of things that you get with fires. I didn't get that. And I think that probably did impact the project in terms of both the plants that grew, because they had to grow through that thatch, and then, insects too, right? There are some insects that don't do well with heavy thatch. They like bare ground and lots of sunshine, and they just didn't have that. So yeah, if I did it in a year that was burned, I'm sure I'd find a lot of things that were different.
Were there a lot of, when you saw the insect damage, was that uniform or was it spotty? You saw several different insect damages due to the, the beetles or whatever.
Mm-hmm. It depended on the beetle. So with the little head cutting weevil, the one that was decapitating the sunflowers, that was just spotty. You'd see it around the prairie. I think I only saw one or two, maybe two inside my plot that happened to. The leaf beetles, at least in 2018, they were pretty uniformly hitting sunflowers. When they sort of had just one of those big population cycles, there are just a lot of them. And I would say there were not very many stiff sunflowers within the entire prairie that didn't get hit by them. And that entire prairie it's probably a total of like 7 acres, right? So it's not huge, but 7 acres is a lot for a little tiny beetle like that to cover. And it's interesting because I've seen that beetle since then, now that I know what I'm looking for. And I've seen them every year, but I've never seen them at the abundance that I saw that year. And I've never seen them where they're wiping out entire sunflower heads across an entire plant. So there was something happening that year that allowed that insect to cycle like it did. And then the Japanese beetles, I've been really watching them because it's only been maybe 3, 4, 5 years that they've been here in town at big abundances. They just moved in recently, and I'm still trying to figure out what they're going to do to our prairies. They're really nasty on our garden. I knew that. But in prairies, I see them eating the flowers of lead plant. Interestingly, I see them hanging out on tick clovers, desmodiums, and then a little bit on lespedizas, some of the native lespediza plants. But I don't think that they don't seem like they're having enough of an impact that they're going to wipe out any of those plant species. I still see seed production on them, and they're hitting some of the flowers, but not enough of them that I'm really worried. So at this point, I'm not totally concerned.
I was just wondering, Chris, if you thought about maybe going back in 5 years to see what's different. Maybe those frogs are taking over or something.
Boy, that would be okay. Yeah, I definitely have thought about that. There's so many options, and I was going to go. I went back and found the plot the next spring and reflagged it, and I was going to visit it just a few times during that year, and I don't know. It didn't feel like, I think I was ready to take a break from it. But I think you're right. Like in several years, it would be really fun to go back and do it again. I still have the flags in the ground. I keep trying to find them and make sure they're there, just so I have that option. If I want to use the same, although like I said earlier, it'd be fun to do it in a different place too. Yeah, boy, a takeover by tree frogs would be just about as cute as you can think of, isn't it? That'd be great. You guys have tree frogs, I assume, right? You see tree frogs in San Antonio, that area? Yeah, okay. What else can I tell you? Thanks, Suzanne.
Somebody was asking, do you speak to classes such as eighth graders and such?
I do when I have time. I wish I could do nothing but this because that would be a lot of fun. But I'm not opposed to it. I mean, if I can squeeze it into my schedule, and you've got a class that you know of that you think would be excited to hear this, let me know. And if I can find the time, I'd love to do it. If you don't follow my blog already, it can. The nice thing about the blog, so I wrote a book in 2009 that came out in 2010 that was about prairie management, and it was fun to write the book. I wrote it because there wasn't a book like it that I had found. The frustrating part about a book I found is that as soon as you finish writing it, you wish you had written it differently because you learn new things, you change your opinions, or you know. And so it took a year between writing and publication, which was frustrating because I already had a whole bunch of things I wanted to change and I couldn't. And then when the book came out, the second frustration was I couldn't talk about it with people. You know, I couldn't get their feedback. I couldn't discuss ideas that they had related to what I was talking about. And that's why I started the blog in 2010, because it was later in the same year that the book came out. It's like, I have to have some way to talk to people about this. And I mean, Suzanne's a great example. There are people on that blog who follow it and comment fairly regularly. And then there are a lot of people who don't, that just sort of follow along, which is also great. But if you're interested in prairies, and want to get into some discussions with people, it's one of the few comment sections that I've ever seen that is really kind and considerate and polite and generous. And I've had to, I think in 10 years, I've had to block 2 people, which is pretty amazing. Everybody else has been great.
You have invasive grasses and forbs in these prairies quite often?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. In this particular prairie, we've got things like Kentucky bluegrass and smooth brome, which are the 2 bigger invasive grasses. Invasive forbs. This prairie, it's not terrible. We have some musk thistles. Boy, I'm sure there are others I'm not thinking of. Sweet clover, which isn't really super bad where we are. I mean, there's a lot of it, but it's not really aggressive. So yeah, we do. And then a lot of the prairies that I manage, you know, we deal with the same grasses, but also things like tall fescue. Southeast Nebraska, we're starting to get some of the Caucasian blue stem coming up from the south where you guys are. That's exciting. And then some of the bigger perennial forbs would be things like St. John's wort, leafy spurge, or Sericula spediza, some of those sorts of things. But in this particular prairie, it's in pretty decent shape that way. Actually, trees are the bigger issue, you know, especially in a small prairie like that, surrounded by trees. It's just you're constantly battling the influx of trees that are just coming in from every direction. That's probably our biggest invasive problem. Jargon acronym, CRP. So Conservation Reserve Program was what I was talking about earlier. What else? It's 8:01. I can stick around if other people want to, but we filled our hour.
I think that's it for the questions. Thank you very much, Chris. I enjoyed it. There was a comment about the storytelling slant to it, which I enjoyed also. Some of the best pictures always have a good story behind them.
Yep. Yeah, I appreciate it. This is a lot of fun. I'm always glad to see organizations that care about prairies. In Nebraska, we actually don't have very many. We've got the Nebraska Sandhills, which is 12 million acres of contiguous prairie. We've got a lot of different kinds of prairie, but we have a population of people who we don't have this kind of organization very often. So it's really cool to talk to people who are excited about prairies. So thanks for inviting me.
Welcome. I remember visiting Fort Robb up in the northwest corner.
Yeah.
And, that's before I really was interested in prairies or understood what they were. But I guess you consider the grasslands up there a prairie.
Oh, for sure. Yep.
So, yeah. I remember it was very interesting.
It's a lot different than flat cornfields.
Yeah, a lot. Okay, thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Do the officers want to stick around for a few minutes?